There is a ton of different opinions on who is the best boss of Elden Ring. Is it Malenia? Is it Messmer? Is it Bayle? In my opinion, it's none of them. Instead, it's someone I don't see mentioned a lot. Midra, Lord of the Frenzied Flame. And today, we'll dive into what makes him be better than those other bosses, and why despite being a better boss, he's been overshadowed by those other bosses. And to get why I think he's the best, I think we should rate him in these 4 categories: design, atmosphere, visuals, and the most important one, gameplay. Let's start with his design. What's cool about Midra's design is that he's an old gremlin looking fella at first with a sword stuck in his head. But once he pulls that sword out, you can see him essentially transform into a demon. His features like the super skeletal body and the tattered cloth still remain, but his head is now just fire. This design is used before in the Frenzied Flame ending, but it's still really cool fighting a guy shooting fire lasers out of his head. But what makes the design more menacing is the atmosphere of the fight. The fight has this creepy atmosphere made by the area leading up to it, with the Dark Forest essentially being an Elden Ring horror game, and him begging you to not come closer throughout the castle. And the movements that the boss does have this really weird feel to them, with how slow and floaty they are, a lot like the dancer from DS3, adding more to his creepiness. His OST is also really creepy. But moving on, let's get into his visuals. Now Midra doesn't lean too heavily into this category like some other bosses, but he still does it pretty well. His main visual theme is obviously Frenzied Flame, and Frenzied Flame always looks cool. Like him lighting his sword on fire and shooting waves of it in his phase 2, or his phase 2 explosion, or his laser beam. But overall, Midra gives up a lot of that visual spectacle for better visibility and gameplay, which is our next point. Gameplay is what truly makes Midra the best boss. All of Midra's attacks are properly telegraphed and completely fair, and dodging them feels amazing. His attacks have this tempo to them like some of the DS3 bosses like Gale or Nameless King, and it's this rhythm of dodge hit, dodge hit, dodge hit that makes the fight flow really smoothly. And his health is big enough that unless you're using some broken build, you really have to master the fight to beat him. But it's also small enough so that the fight doesn't drag on for too long. Overall, Midra abandons all the fancy backflips, waterfall dances, and visual clutter that Elden Ring bosses usually have and goes back to the basics, and just really perfects them. And Midra is pretty hard. Obviously not as hard as some more unfair stuff like Radon or Malenia, but he's about as hard as you can get while still sticking to the basics. No death in this fight feels like the game cheating you. Instead, every single death feels like your mistake. Midra's gameplay doesn't really have a flaw and is perfection. And to me, gameplay is the most important aspect in a fight, and while Midra may have worse visuals than Bayle or a worse design than Messmer, or he isn't as hard as Radon, but because of the fact that he has the best gameplay and atmosphere out of all of them, it makes him the true best boss to me. But now let's talk about why he's been overshadowed by those other bosses despite being better. And I think it's because despite of how good of a fight Midra has, he doesn't really have anything special. Like for example, Malenia was the most talked about boss of the base game because she was the hardest. Same with Radon in the Shadow of the Earth 2 DLC. Messmer is talked about a lot because he's essentially the face of the DLC. Bayle is talked about a ton because of his visuals and more importantly, Egon's voice acting. All of these are things that are really special about these bosses. Midra's only real special thing is his horror atmosphere, but that's less Midra and more the area before him. And as good as Midra is, he really isn't all that unique, and that's why I think he's been overshadowed by those other bosses. But despite being overshadowed, with how good his gameplay is, I think he truly is the best boss of Elden Ring. But who do you guys think is the best boss in Elden Ring? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and like and subscribe for more like this.